The antelope tracks were 3 days old, pressed into dry grass that crackled under the summer sun. Wakan rode his painted mare along the high ridge, scanning the prairie that rolled away in endless waves of sage and stone. He had left his band's camp at dawn, expecting to return by nightfall with enough meat to feed his cousins and the elders who tended the cooking fires. The morning of late July in the year 1870 promised to be clear and hot, the kind of day when a man could think without distraction and hunt without interference. From the far ridge, a lone rider paused light, catching on a small tin star at his vest. He studied the wagon ruts and the thin smoke on the horizon, then turned his horse down slope, keeping his distance. Tracks told him enough for now. He would follow without spooking the killers. But the wind changed direction, carrying a smell that had nothing to do with game or grass. Gunpowder sharp and bitter, mingled with a stench of scorched canvas and something worse, the unmistakable copper tang of blood left too long in the sun. Wakan reined his mare to a halt and stood in his stirrups, scanning the terrain ahead. Smoke rose in thin dark threads against the cloudless sky, and his chest tightened with a familiar dread. He touched the rifle, slung across his back, and the knife sheathed at his belt, then urged his horse forward at a careful walk. When he crested the low ridge and looked down into the shallow basin below, the world seemed to tilt. 4 wagons lay scattered like broken toys, their canvas covers torn and blackened by fire. Bodies sprawled in the dirt, limbs twisted at unnatural angles, clothing soaked dark with blood that had already dried to the color of rust. Crates and barrels had been smashed open, their contents trampled into the earth. A woman's bonnet fluttered from a wagon wheel, caught by the breeze like a pale ghost. The stink of death rose thick enough to choke on. Wakan's mare's shied nostrils flaring wide, and he steadied her with a hand on her neck. He studied the scene below with a practiced eye of a warrior who had seen too much violence in his 30 years. At first glance, it looked like a raid, brutal, efficient, the kind of slaughter that settlers blamed on his people without question or proof. But something was wrong. The bodies were clustered too close together, herded into a tight group, as if they had been driven there before being cut down. And there in the churned earth around the wagons, hoof prints stood out clear and deep. Not the narrow unshaw tracks of Lakota ponies, but the wide ironshaw prints of ranch horses. Movement caught his attention. A young woman, maybe 20 years old, lay on her side near the center wagon. Her dress was torn from shoulder to hem, one sleeve hanging by threads, and her face was strewn with dirt and blood that had run from a cut above her eyebrow. She was alive, dragging herself forward on her elbows, reaching toward a small boy who sat in the dust, sobbing with the helpless confusion of a child who did not understand why his world had shattered. A few paces away, an older woman clutched her right arm to her chest, bent over in pain, her face gray with shock. An old man lay half buried under a shattered crate, each shallow breath rattling wet in his chest. Then Wakan saw the arrows, 3 of them driven deep into the backs of the dead men who lay face down in the dirt. Lakota arrows fletched with hawk feathers and painted with the red and black bands his own cousins used when they hunted elk in the high country. But the shafts were wrong too straight. 2 new, clearly purchased from a trader or stolen from a cache. Real warriors did not leave their arrows behind unless they had been forced to flee in haste. And there were no signs of pursuit or panic here. Only cold, calculated murder. He looked again at the hoof prints, at the tight cluster of bodies, at the arrows thrust into flesh like accusations written in blood. Someone had staged this massacre to look like Lakota work. Someone wanted the world to believe his people were responsible for slaughtering innocent settlers. The young woman's eyes found him. She froze, hands still outstretched toward the crying boy. and then her face twisted with a mixture of terror and fury that made her look older than her years. She threw herself over the child, shielding him with her body, and screamed at Wakan in a voice raw with grief and rage. "You did this, your kind, murdered them all." Wakan did not answer. Words would mean nothing to her, not now, not when she was drowning in fresh loss. Instead, he lifted 2 fingers to his mouth and whistled sharp and high. From the ridge behind him, 2 younger men rode down on swift ponies. Yaji, lean and quick-tempered, barely past 20 summers, carried a bow across his back and wore his hair in 2 long braids wrapped with red cloth. Delson, broader in the shoulders and quieter in manner, held a rifle in his hands and studied the scene below with narrowed eyes. They were Wakan's cousins, sons of his mother's sister, and they had followed him out to help with the hunt. Now they pulled their horses to a stop and stared at the carnage spread before them. Delson made a soft sound of disgust deep in his throat. Yaji spat into the dust and cursed in Lakota. "Who did this thing?" Yaji asked, his voice tight with anger. Wakan pointed first at the hoof prints, then at the arrows driven into dead flesh. "Not us," he said in their own language. "But someone wants it to look that way. Someone who knows how to make white settlers afraid and angry." He dismounted and walked slowly among the bodies, speaking low and steady to his cousins, trying to keep the woman from panicking further. She clutched the boy tighter, her eyes tracking Wakan's every move, as if he were a wolf circling wounded prey. He crouched beside one of the dead men, middle-aged, sturdy, with work-calloused hands and a wedding ring on his left hand, and gently rolled him onto his back. The arrow in his spine had been driven in after death. The blood around the wound was already drying, and there were powder burns on the man's chest from a rifle fired at close range. 4 people still drew breath in this place of death. The young woman, whose torn dress and fierce eyes spoke of desperation and determination in equal measure. The boy, no more than 8 or 9 years old, with dark hair and a face too pale with shock. The older woman, whose broken arm hung at a sickening angle, and the old man, gut-shot and fading fast, his skin taking on the gray pore that spoke of minutes rather than hours remaining. Wakan approached the dead man, whose wedding ring matched the one on the older woman's hand. From the stiff fingers, he carefully pried loose a leather satchel, the kind used to carry important papers. Inside, he found documents neatly folded, a water rights contract stamped with an official seal, and a small ledger bound in cloth. The top sheet of the contract granted water rights to land along Copper Creek. The ledger was filled with notes written in a careful, educated hand. Names, dates, sums of money, and detailed accounts of intimidation and violence. One signature appeared again and again, bold and sprawling across multiple pages. Godfrey Pike. Wakan knew that name the way every Lakota on the high prairie knew it. Pike was the largest cattle baron in the valley, a man who believed land belonged to whoever could hold it by force and cunning. His riders carried rifles and wore the XX brand burned into their saddles and their souls. Wakan had seen Pike's men burn out homesteaders who refused to sell their claims, poison water holes to drive away Lakota hunting parties, and bribe territorial officials to look the other way while they expanded their empire of grass and blood. Now it seemed Pike had decided a massacre blamed on the Lakota would solve whatever problem this family had posed to his ambitions. Wakan slipped the satchel over his shoulder and turned to the young woman. She glared at him, trembling with a mixture of fury and fear, but she did not scream again. He pointed at the old man lying in the dust, then at the sun climbing higher in the sky, and shook his head slowly. There was not much time left. Before he could decide what to do next, the sound of hooves reached them from the east, growing louder by the second. He spun rifle coming up to his shoulder, and Yaji and Delson moved to flank him. Through a cloud of dust came a dozen riders' hats pulled low over their faces, bandanas tied across their mouths and noses. A few wore feathers tied to their hatbands in a crude, insulting imitation of Lakota ornamentation. They rode hard, then slowed when they saw Wakan standing among the dead, a warrior in war paint and buckskin facing them without fear. The lead rider pulled down his bandana, revealing a face weathered by sun and wind, with a jagged scar running from his left eyebrow to his jaw. Hard Harry Pike's foreman. Wakan had seen him in Copper Creek, towning out silver coins for men who did the kind of work that could not be done in daylight. Harry stared at Wakan for a long moment, his eyes cold and calculating. Then he laughed a sound like gravel scraping against wood. "Well, hellfire and damnation," he drawled, his voice carrying across the dust. "We were told the savages had already cleared this place out proper. Didn't expect to find one still standing here admiring his work." Wakan stepped directly in front of the young woman, and the boy, his rifle held low, but ready. "You will not touch them," he said in rough but clear English, each word deliberate and hard. Harry's grin widened, showing teeth stained yellow by tobacco. "Ain't that something fine?" he said, looking back at his men. "A red skin with a conscience, and manners to boot." Pike didn't mention nothing about that part of the plan. He raised his hand and his men fanned out in a loose half-circle, rifles, lifting with the smooth coordination of men who had done this kind of work many times before. "Now I reckon you ought to step aside real peaceable like, friend. We got orders to finish what we started here. Can't have witnesses running around town saying things that ain't true now, can we?" Wakan did not move. Behind him, he could hear the young woman's ragged breathing, could feel the weight of her gaze on his back. Yazi and Delson wheeled their horses to the flanks, cutting off Harry's easy angles of attack. "Last chance, savage," Harry said, his voice dropping all pretense of friendliness. Wakan pulled back the hammer on his rifle. The click was very loud in the sudden, terrible silence. Harry cursed viciously and spurred his horse forward. Bullets kicked up dirt around Wakan's boots, splitting the air with sounds like angry hornets. He dropped to one knee and fired the shot, punching through the shoulder of the nearest rider and spinning him backward out of his saddle. Yaji's bow sang its high, deadly note, and an arrow took another man in the thigh, sending him toppling with a scream. Delson fired twice with the methodical calm of a hunter, dropping a third horse and sending its rider sprawling face first into the dirt. The fight was brief and vicious, the kind of violence that erupted and ended in less than a minute. Harry's men had expected an easy cleanup, not a Lakota warrior with two skilled hunters at his back and nothing to lose. When two more of Pike's riders fell dead and the rest scattered in confusion, Harry wheeled his horse and retreated, his face twisted with rage and something that might have been fear. But before he rode off, his eyes found the leather satchel lying in the dust where Wakan had dropped it during the fight. Papers had spilled out, the contract fluttering in the hot breeze. Harry's face went hard as a stone when he saw Pike's signature on the documents. He pointed at Wakan, his fingers shaking with fury. "You just made the biggest mistake of your miserable life, savage. That there is property of Mr. Godfrey Pike himself, and he don't let nobody steal from him and live to brag about it. You hear me? Nobody." He rode off with his remaining men following, but Wen knew with cold certainty they would be back. This was no longer just about covering up a massacre. Pike's men had seen the contract and the ledger. They knew what those documents could do to their employer's carefully constructed empire. Wakan picked up the satchel and stuffed the papers back inside with quick, precise movements. When he turned, the young woman was staring at him, her face pale beneath the dirt and blood, but her eyes were sharp and measuring. "Why?" she whispered, her voice cracking. "Why would you help us when your people did this?" He did not answer immediately. There was no time for long explanations, and she would not believe him anyway. Not yet. Roman, the old man, was dying with each shallow breath, and the sun was climbing higher, stealing what little time they had left. Instead of words, wagon knelt beside Roman and examined the wound as carefully as his limited knowledge allowed. The old man's belly was torn open, the edges ragged and dark with blood that seeped through the cloth someone had pressed against it. Roman's skin had taken on the gray, waxy look of a man already halfway to the spirit world. Wakan had seen wounds like this before in raids and skirmishes that had marked his youth. Men did not survive them, not on the open prairie, not without a skilled surgeon and strong medicine. And even then, the chances were as thin as morning mist. He looked up at the young woman. "My name is Wakan," he said quietly. "What is yours?" She hesitated, as if giving her name might be a betrayal, but then said, "Valeria. Valeria Roman. This is my brother Roland, my mother Esther, and my grandfather Roman." "My father Victor," is her voice broke, and she gestured at the bodies lying in the dust. Waka nodded slowly. "Valeria," he repeated, tasting the unfamiliar syllables. "We must move from this place. The men will return with more riders. They will bring others from town who will believe what they want to believe." "I won't leave my father," Valeria said, her voice rising. "He deserves more than to be left for coyotes and vultures." Wakan glanced at the sun, measuring the hours against the danger, and made his decision. "Then we will bury him," he said. "But we must be quick." Yazi protested in Lakota, his words coming fast and urgent. "Why can we have no time for this? If Pike's men returned with reinforcements, then we will deal with them when they come." Wakan said, his voice carrying the flat finality that ended arguments. "But we will not leave this man for scavengers. I have seen what it does to the living when the dead are not honored. They work together under the brutal sun, digging a grave in the hard, rocky soil." Valeria insisted on helping, and Wakan did not argue. She used a broken shovel, her hands blistering and bleeding as she hacked at the earth with a desperate energy that spoke of grief too large to contain. Juan worked beside her in silence, his own hands growing raw and aching, while Yaji kept watch from the ridge and Delson tended to the wounded. When the hole was finally deep enough, they lifted Victor's body with gentle care and lowered him into the ground. Valeria pressed her father's wedding ring into a flat stone and placed it on his chest, her fingers lingering there for a long moment. She murmured a prayer, not loud enough for Wakan to hear the words, but he understood the meaning. In her bowed head and shaking shoulders, they covered the grave with dirt and piled rocks over it to keep animals from digging. When Roland came forward and placed a small wooden horse, carved and polished smooth by loving hands on top of the stones, Valeria pulled him close and buried her face in his hair. "Papa made it for me last winter," Roland said, his voice barely a whisper. "I know, sweetheart." Valeria said he would want you to leave it here. Juan gave them a moment of privacy, then said, "We must go now. Your grandfather needs more help than I can give, and staying here will get us all killed." They lashed Roman to a travois of the old man too weak to protest or even acknowledge what was happening around him. Esther, her broken arm splinted as well as Delson could manage, rode on one of the surviving wagon horses. Valeria swung Roland up behind her on another horse, holding him tight as they started toward the distant line of cottonwoods that marked Copper Creek. The land here was cruelly open, offering almost no cover, just rolling prairie dotted with sage and the occasional dry wash. The sun hammered down without mercy, and Walken could feel sweat running down his back beneath his buckskin shirt. They were halfway across the exposed flat when gunfire erupted from the ridge they had just left. Bullets hissed through the air, kicking up geysers of dust around the horses' hooves. Walcan spurred his mare forward the travois, bouncing wildly behind him, threatening to tear loose. Valeria bent low over Roland's head, urging her horse faster. Esther clung to Delson's saddle with her good hand, her face twisted in pain with every jarring step. Yazi wheeled his pony and fired back his rifle, cracking in short, sharp bursts that made Pike's men dive for cover. The riders on the ridge, maybe 6 or 7 of them, slowed their pursuit, but did not stop. They were testing the distance, seeing how far their bullets would carry and how many shots they could risk before running out of ammunition. Wakan spotted a shallow wash choked with sage and prickly yucca ahead and to the left. "There," he shouted, pointing with his free hand. "Get into the wash." They veered toward it, horses scrambling down the crumbling bank, and plunged into the narrow cut just as a fresh volley of shots rang out. The wash was barely deep enough to hide them, scarcely 4F'd from bottom to rim, but it was enough to break the line of fire. They dismounted quickly, pulling the horses down into the dirt, and waited with pounding hearts and burning lungs. The sound of hooves grew louder, circling above them like wolves around wounded elk. Harry's voice carried on the hot wind shouting orders. They went into that wash circle around and flushed them out. But the wash twisted and turned, and the thick brush made it nearly impossible to see more than a few yards in any direction. After several tense minutes during which Wakan could hear his own heartbeat loud in his ears, the riders gave up and moved on their curses and threats, fading into the distance. Wakan waited until he could no longer hear any sound of pursuit, then gestured for the others to follow. They moved quickly through the wash, staying low and quiet, until it widened and spilled out into the riverbed, where Copper Creek ran shallow and cool over smooth stones. The cottonwoods rose ahead, their leaves rustling silver green in the afternoon breeze, offering the first real shade and shelter they had found. Wakan led them deep into the grove and helped Valeria lift Roland down from the horse. The boy was shaking his face pale and sterile with tears he had been too frightened to shed while they were running. They made a rough camp under the spreading branches as the sun began its slow descent toward the western horizon. Wakan built a small fire just large enough to boil water and tore strips of cloth from his own shirt to clean Roman's wound. The old man's breathing was wet and labored, each breath a visible struggle, and his skin had gone cold despite the summer heat. Wakan did what he could, pressing the cloth tight against the torn flesh, but he knew it was not enough. He had seen too many men die from wounds like this. The bullet had torn through vital organs, and there was nothing anyone could do out here, miles from help and proper medicine. Valeria knelt beside him, watching his hands move with methodical care. "You should take us to Copper Creek," she said quietly, her voice steady, despite the fear in her eyes. "There's a doctor there. Maybe he can save my grandfather." "Maybe," Juan said, but his tone suggested he did not believe it. Valeria's hands clenched into fists on her knees. "I don't understand any of this," she said, her voice rising slightly. "Why are you helping us? We're not your people. You owe us nothing. We're the ones who took your land, who killed your buffalo, who—" "Stop," Wakan said gently. He looked up from Roman's wound and met her eyes. "You did not do those things. You were just trying to live same as my people, same as everyone." "Then why?" Valerie pressed. "Why risk your life for strangers?" Wakan was silent for a long moment, staring into the small fire. Then he said, "When I was 12, winters old, blue-coat soldiers came to our winter camp. They said we were trespassing on land that belonged to the government, even though our people had hunted there for generations beyond counting. When my father tried to explain, tried to show them the treaty his grandfather had signed, they shot him. They burned our lodges and killed anyone who tried to run." He paused, his jaw tight. "I watched my father die in the snow. I remember thinking that if I could just move fast enough, be strong enough, I could stop what was happening. But I was a boy, and I could not." Valeria's eyes filled with tears. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "That's horrible." Wakan shook his head. "It is the way things have been for a long time, but I made a promise to myself that day. I promised that if I ever had the chance to stop such things from happening to someone else, I would not stand aside. I would not let people suffer just because others decided they did not matter." He looked at Roland, who had fallen asleep against Esther's shoulder, exhausted beyond endurance. "So, I help you because I know what it is to lose everything, and because it is the right thing to do." Before Valeria could respond, the sound of hooves splashing upstream cut through the peaceful evening. Wakan moved instantly, his hand clamping over Valeria's mouth as he pulled her down into the shadows behind a fallen log. He gestured sharply at Delson, who grabbed Roland and Esther and dragged them under the overturned wagon they had salvaged from the massacre site. Yazi slipped behind another log, his bow already in his hands, an arrow nocked and ready. The riders came slowly picking their way carefully through the cottonwoods in the fading light. 5 of them moving in a loose line, rifles held ready across their saddles. Wakan recognized the careful professional way they moved, that these were not angry townspeople or panicked amateurs. These were Pike's experienced men, hunters tracking wounded game. Wakan pressed his spare rifle into Valeria's hands and whispered directly into her ear, his breath warm against her skin. "You load for me. When I fire, you give it back loaded. Can you do that?" Valeria's eyes went wide with fear, but she nodded, her jaw clenching with determination. Her hands shook as she took the weapon, but she held it steady. Wakan moved to the edge of their makeshift camp, staying low behind the natural cover. One of the riders dismounted and crept forward on foot, his boots making soft crunching sounds on dry leaves and twigs. Another stayed mounted, covering the treine with his rifle. The others fanned out, trying to encircle the camp without exposing themselves. Wen waited until the dismounted man was close enough that he could hear the man's breathing, and then he sighted along his rifle and fired. The shot took the man in the leg, spinning him around with a shout of pain and surprise. The other riders opened fire immediately, bullets smashing into trees and sending splinters flying through the air. Wakan ducked back, shoved the empty rifle at Valeria, and grabbed the loaded one she held out to him. "There," he said urgently, pointing at the mounted rider. "See that rock ledge above his head? Not his head, the rock. Just hit the rock." Valeria swallowed hard, her throat working visibly, then raised the rifle to her shoulder. Her hands shook, but she forced them steady, sighting along the barrel, the way her father had taught her years ago when she was just a girl learning to hunt rabbits. She squeezed the trigger, and the rifle kicked hard against her shoulder. The bullet smashed into the stone ledge directly above the mounted rider's head, sending chips of rock and a shower of dust raining down on him. He ducked instinctively, flinching away from the falling debris. And in that brief moment, when his rifle wavered off target, Wakan moved. He fired twice fast and accurate, and the rider toppled from his saddle with a strangled cry. Yazi's bow sang its deadly song, and another man fell clutching at the arrow buried in his chest. Delson fired from under the wagon, his shots careful, and measured each one, finding its mark. The remaining riders, realizing they were pinned down and taking heavy losses, pulled back into the gathering darkness, their curses and threats fading away. Wakan waited, every muscle tense and ready, until he was absolutely certain they were gone. Then he turned to Valeria, who was still holding the rifle, her face pale, but her eyes steady and fierce. "You did well," he said quietly. Valeria let out a shaky breath and handed the rifle back with trembling hands. "I've never shot at a person before," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I thought I would freeze, but you did not shoot at him," Juan reminded her gently. "You shot at the rock. That was smart thinking. You gave me the opening I needed without taking a life. There is honor in that. Valeria looked at him for a long moment, something shifting in her expression. Thank you, she said, for trusting me, for giving me a chance to help instead of just hiding. You earned it, Watkins said simply. The night passed slowly, each of them taking turns keeping watch while the others tried to sleep. Roman's breathing grew steadily weaker, the wet rattle in his chest more pronounced with each hour. Wakan sat beside him through most of the night, periodically checking the wound and knowing there was nothing more he could do. By dawn, Roman was gone. His breathing had stopped sometime in the dark hours before sunrise, slipping away so quietly that Esther did not realize it until she reached out to touch his hand and found it cold and still. Valeria stood beside the body, wrapped in a thin blanket against the morning chill, and stared at the gray river running past their camp. Her face was expressionless, carefully blank, but her hands were clenched so tight her knuckles had gone white as bone. That's everyone, she said, her voice flat and hollow. My father, my grandfather, everyone who knew how to protect us, is gone. She turned to look at Wakan, and the raw desperation in her eyes cut through him like a blade. You have to take us all the way to Copper Creek, all the way to safety. If you leave us on the road, Pike's men will finish us before we make it another mile. Please. Juan thought of his own people waiting for him to return with the meat he had promised. He thought of the danger that followed this woman and her family like a shadow. The riders who would not stop until all witnesses were dead and buried. He thought of the long journey ahead and the risks it would bring. And he thought of his father falling in the snow and the promise he had made to a boy with blood on his hands and ice in his heart. I will take you, he said, all the way. They buried Roman at sunrise on a rocky rise overlooking the river, in a spot where the morning light touched first and lingered longest. The ground was harder here, more stone than soil, and it took longer to dig deep enough. Wakan and Yaji worked the shovels, while Delson kept watch with his rifle, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of pursuit. Valeria and Esther wrapped Roman in the blanket and said their goodbyes in low broken voices that carried the weight of unspeakable loss. Roland stood apart from the others, staring at the ground with empty eyes, his small hands clenched at his sides. When the grave was filled and the stones piled high enough to keep animals from disturbing it, they stood together in silence. Valeria spoke a few words, her voice steady despite the tears tracking slowly down her cheeks. He was a good man. He never hurt anyone who didn't deserve it. He just wanted to build something that would last, something we could be proud of and pass on to our children. Wakan nodded slowly. He understood that desire. Every man wanted to leave something behind, some mark that said he had lived and mattered. They mounted up and rode west, following the river toward Copper Creek and whatever waited for them there. The land here was rougher than the open prairie, cut by deep ravines and dry washes that would turn into raging torrents when the autumn rains came. The sky was heavy with clouds that seemed to press down on them, and the air was thick and oppressive, with the promise of a storm building somewhere just beyond the horizon. By midday, the first drops began to fall. Within minutes, the rain became a solid wall of water that turned the trail into treacherous, sucking mud. The horses struggled, their hooves slipping and sliding on the slick ground, threatening to go down and take their riders with them. Thunder rolled across the prairie like distant cannon fire, and lightning flickered in jagged bolts that seemed close enough to touch. Juan led them to an overturned wagon he spotted, half buried in a ravine, the remnants of some earlier tragedy, the wood weathered gray and the wheels rotted away. They crowded beneath its shoulders, pressed close together, while the storm hammered down with furious intensity. Lightning flickered through the cracks between boards, illuminating their faces in brief, harsh flashes that stole color and warmth. Roland pressed against Wakan's side, shivering despite the fact that the temperature had barely dropped. Valeria sat beside them, her torn dress plastered to her skin, her hair hanging in wet tangles that dripped water down her back. She looked at Wakan, and for a moment their eyes met in the flickering light. Neither spoke, but something passed between them. An acknowledgement of shared danger, of trust, slowly being built in the space between strangers who had become unlikely allies. When the storm finally passed, leaving the world washed clean and shining, they climbed out into air that smelled of wet earth and sage. The prairie was transformed puddles reflecting the pale sky like scattered mirrors, and every plant seemed to glow with renewed life. They rode on, passing the burned-out shell of a homestead that stood alone on a low hill like a monument to broken dreams. The well had been deliberately filled with rocks and debris, making it useless. The timbers of the house were blackened and collapsed, the windows empty and staring. And there, burned deep into the gatepost, was the double XX brand that marked Pike's property. Wakan pointed at it without speaking. Valeria stared at the ruin, her face hardening into something cold and determined. "How many?" she asked quietly. Wakan shrugged. "Many. Too many to count. He takes what he wants and destroys anyone who stands in his way." "Not anymore," Valeria said, her voice carrying a steel edge that had not been there before. "We have the ledger. We have proof of what he's done. That has to count for something." "Maybe," Wakan said, but his tone suggested he had seen too many times when proof and truth meant nothing in the face of power and money. They rode in silence after that, each lost in their own dark thoughts. The sun was sinking toward the western horizon, painting the clouds in shades of orange and crimson, when they met Dr. Solomon Pike on the trail. He was driving a two-wheeled mule cart piled high with wooden crates and leather satchels, the kind a traveling doctor used to carry instruments, medicines, and surgical tools. Solomon Pike was thin to the point of gauntness, with a narrow, serious face and eyes that seemed haunted by things he had seen and could not forget. He wore a black coat despite the heat and a wide-brimmed hat, both covered in the pale dust of long travel. When he saw Wakan riding at the head of the small group, he pulled the cart to a halt and raised both hands slowly, palms out, showing he was unarmed. "Good evening," he said carefully, his voice soft and cultured, with the accent of a man educated somewhere back east. "I mean no harm to you or your companions." Juan studied him for a long moment, taking in the exhaustion written in the lines around his eyes and the medical supplies visible in the cart. "Doctor?" he asked in English. Solomon nodded. "Yes, Dr. Solomon Pike. I run a clinic in Copper Creek, such as it is." His eyes moved past Wakan to take in Esther's splinted arm, Roland's pale, exhausted face, and the haunted look in Valeria's eyes. His expression tightened with concern that seemed genuine. "What happened to you people?" Valeria urged her horse forward, her voice sharp with the need to make someone understand and believe. She told him everything, her words clipped and angry, not sparing any of the terrible details: the massacre, the arrows meant to blame the Lakota, the writers who had tried to finish them off. When she mentioned Godfrey Pike's name, Solomon's face went pale beneath, his tan, the color draining away as if someone had pulled a plug. "My brother," he said quietly, almost to himself. Valeria's eyes narrowed with suspicion. "Your brother did this?" Solomon looked away, his hands tightening on the res until his knuckles showed white. "I don't know for certain," he said, each word seeming to cost him something. "But I wouldn't be surprised. Godfrey believes that land and water belong to those strong enough to take them and hold them. He doesn't see people like you as equals. He sees you as obstacles to be removed by whatever means necessary." He climbed down from the cart with slow, careful movements and approached Esther. "May I examine your arm, ma'am?" he asked gently. Esther nodded, too exhausted and in too much pain to object. Solomon's hands were skilled, and sure as he unwrapped Delson's rough splint and examined the break. He made soft considering sounds as his fingers probed the swollen flesh. Then he pulled fresh supplies from his cart and set the bone, properly wrapping it in clean cloth and wooden splints bound with leather straps. When Valeria showed him the leather satchel and explained what was inside the contract, the ledger, all the careful documentation of Pike's crimes, Solomon's face went even paler, if that was possible. His hands trembled slightly as he opened the satchel and examined the papers, his eyes moving quickly over the signatures and dates. "This is dangerous," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "More dangerous than you can imagine. If my brother knows you have this evidence, if he even suspects it exists, he'll kill everyone who's seen it. He'll burn the whole territory to the ground before he lets this reach a territorial marshal or federal judge." "Then help us," Valeria said, leaning forward with desperate intensity. "Take us to someone who can stop him, someone with the authority and the courage to stand up to your brother." Solomon shook his head slowly, his expression bleak. "The sheriff in Copper Creek is in Godfrey's pocket, bought and paid for years ago. So is half the town council, most of the businessmen, and anyone else with power or influence. If you walk into that town alone with a Lakota warrior at your side and this ledger in your hands, they won't listen to a word you say. They'll see what they want to see. Savages and troublemakers, and they'll lock you up, or worse, before you can open your mouths." Wagon stepped his horse forward, his voice flat and hard. "Then what do you suggest, Doctor? That we run and hide? That we let your brother win?" Solomon looked at him, and for a long moment the two men measured each other across a distance that had nothing to do with the space between their horses. Then Solomon said, "I'll go with you. I'll escort you into town and vouch for your story. It won't be enough by itself, but it might buy us enough time to get this evidence into the right hands." He paused, then added quietly, "My brother keeps Copper Creek on a short leash, but he doesn't control everything. Not yet." He climbed back onto his cart and gestured for them to follow. "Stay close to me," he said, "and be ready for anything. Godfrey has eyes and ears everywhere, and he doesn't take kindly to opposition." They rode into Copper Creek as the sun touched the horizon, casting long shadows across the dusty main street. The town was larger than Wakan had expected. Two saloons facing each other like rival gunfighters, a general store with windows full of goods, a livery stable where the smell of horses and hay drifted out into the evening air, and a dozen smaller buildings clustered around a central square. Men stood on the boardwalks watching them pass with hard, suspicious eyes that measured and judged. A few women pulled their children inside and closed their doors with sounds that carried clearly in the quiet. Sheriff Hardison was waiting for them in front of the jail as if he had known they were coming. He was a big man, barrel-chested and red-faced, with a tin star pinned to his vest and a pistol sitting heavy on his hip. He stood with his arms crossed over his chest, flanked by two deputies who looked young enough to be nervous, but old enough to know how to use the rifles they carried. Solomon Hardison called out his voice, carrying across the street like a warning bell. "What in blazes are you doing bringing into my town? You know the rules about Indians coming in armed." Solomon climbed down from his cart and walked forward with his hands raised in a calming gesture. "Sheriff, these people need help. There's been a massacre out on the Eastern Trail. An entire family murdered, their wagons burned." "I know about the massacre." Hardison interrupted his voice, cutting across Solomon's words like a blade. He reached into his coat and pulled out a blood-stained Lakota arrow, holding it up high so the gathering crowd could see it clearly. This here was found at the site by men who rode out to investigate. One of the survivors said he saw a war party riding off whooping and hollering like the savages they are. Now you bring one of them right into my town, bold as brass. Wakan felt the crowd's mood shift and darken, felt anger and fear rising like a wave about to break. He kept his hands away from his rifle, kept his face impassive and calm, but his muscles were coiled tight beneath his skin, ready to explode into motion if needed. Valeria urged her horse forward, her voice ringing out clear and strong across the street. "That arrow is a lie," she shouted, anger giving her volume and force. "It wasn't the Lakota who killed my family. It was Godfrey Pike's men. They murdered my father, and grandfather tried to kill all of us. And this man saved our lives." She held up the leather satchel for everyone to see. "We have proof. My father's ledger with Pike's signature on every dirty deal, every murder, every crime he's committed." The crowd murmured the sound like wind through dry grass, uncertain and shifting. Hardison's eyes flicked to the satchel, and something dark and calculating crossed his face. He stepped forward, his hand moving toward his pistol, in a gesture that could have been casual or threatening, depending on how one chose to read it. "I'm going to have to take that ledger into evidence, miss," he said, his voice flat and official. "Can't have private citizens running around with documents that might pertain to ongoing investigations." Solomon moved to stand between Hardison and Valeria, his thin body seeming to grow taller with determination. "Sheriff, you will not," he said, his voice hard, in a way Wakan had not heard before. "These people are under my protection as a physician and as a citizen of this territory. If you want that ledger, you'll need a warrant signed by a territorial judge. And we both know the nearest judge is 3 days' ride from here." For a moment that seemed to stretch out like warm honey harden, and Solomon faced each other on the dusty street while the crowd watched and waited. Wakan saw the sheriff's hand hover near his gun, saw the muscles in his jaw work as he ground his teeth together. Then Hardison forced a tight, insincere smile onto his face. "Fine," he said, the word coming out clipped and hard. "But I'm taking the savage into custody for his own protection. Can't have him wandering around free when folks are angry and scared. Liable to get himself hurt or cause trouble, you understand?" Before anyone could protest or react, the two deputies moved with sudden speed, grabbing Wakan's arms and twisting them behind his back with practiced efficiency. He could have fought, could have broken free, thrown them off, made them pay for putting their hands on him. But he caught Solomon's eyes across the space between them, saw the desperate plea written there as clearly as words on paper, and he forced himself to go still. They dragged him off his horse and into the jail, their hands rough and careless, and threw him into a cell with enough force that he stumbled against the far wall. The bar door slammed shut with a sound like finality, and the lock clicked home. Wakan stood in the center of the small cell, breathing slowly and evenly, listening to the sounds of the town outside. He could hear Valeria's voice raised in protest, could hear Solomon's softer tones trying to calm her. He could hear the crowd beginning to disperse their voices, fading into the evening. And he could hear faint, but unmistakable, the sound of men gathering somewhere nearby, their voices rising with the particular cadence of anger, being stoked and shaped into something dangerous. The night was going to be long, and he suspected it would end in blood. The cell was narrow and dark, maybe 8 feet on a side, with walls built from stone blocks mortared together with casual competence. A narrow cot with a stained mattress sat against one wall, and a tin bucket squatted in the corner, its purpose obvious, and its smell barely tolerable. The only light came from a small barred window set high in the wall, through which Wakan could see a narrow slice of darkening sky. He sat on the cot and forced his breathing to slow, forced his mind to clear and sharpen. Panic was the enemy of survival. Fear made men stupid, made them rush when they should wait, made them freeze when they should act. He had learned that lesson young, learned it in blood and loss, and he had never forgotten it. He tested the bars of the cell door, methodically, pressing his weight against each one, checking for rust or weakness. They were solid iron, recently maintained, set deep into the stone. The lock was heavy and well made, the kind that would require a key or significant force to open. The walls were equally solid, the mortar between the stones hard and unyielding. The only way out was through the barred door, and that door was locked tight. He sat back down and waited. Patience was a weapon, and he knew how to wield it. Hours crawled past like wounded animals. The light filtering through the window changed from orange to purple to deep blue-black. Wakan heard the deputies changing shifts, their voices low and bored as they complained about the heat and the long night ahead. One of them brought him a tin plate of beans, swimming in grease, and a cup of water that tasted of metal and dust. Walcate slowly chewing each bite thoroughly, storing energy against whatever was coming. Outside, the town grew louder rather than quieter. As the night deepened, Wakan could hear men gathering in the street, their voices rising in anger that had been carefully cultivated and fed. Someone was making a speech, the words muffled by distance and walls, but the tone unmistakable, full of righteous fury and the kind of certainty that made men dangerous. He pulled himself up to the window by gripping the bars and looked out. Through the narrow gap, he could see part of the main street, lit now by torches and lanterns that cast wild dancing shadows. A crowd had gathered in front of the saloon, maybe 50 men, some holding rifles, others clutching bottles that they raised in salute to the speaker. At the center of the crowd, standing on the saloon porch, with the confidence of a man who owned everything he surveyed, was Godfrey Pike. Even from this distance, Wakan could see the power the man wielded like a weapon. He was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in a fine black coat and a wide-brimmed hat with a silver band that caught the torchlight. He spoke with easy authority, his voice carrying across the street, and the crowd hung on his every word like faithful dogs waiting for scraps from their master's table. Beside Pike stood Hard, hairy, arms crossed over his chest, a rifle slung casually over his shoulder. Other ranch hands flanked them, and their faces hard with the look of men who had done violence before and would do it again without hesitation. Wakan could not hear the specific words Pike was saying, but he understood the meaning well enough. Pike was turning the town against him, using the massacre and the planted arrows as proof that the Lakota were a threat that needed to be dealt with decisively. And when Pike was finished talking, when he had whipped the crowd into sufficient fury, they would come for Wakan with a rope and a tree and the absolute certainty that they were doing the right thing. He dropped back down to the floor and began to search the cell more carefully, looking for anything that might be useful. There had to be something, a loose stone, a weak bar, a nail left behind by some previous occupant. But the cell had been built by men who knew their work, and it offered no easy escape. The sound of boots on stone made him turn. The cell door rattled, but it was not opening. Instead, Dr. Solomon Pike stood on the other side of the bars, holding a canvas bag in his hands. He looked pale and drawn his face tight with worry, but his hands were steady. "Sheriff," he called back toward the front room, his voice carefully casual. "I need to examine the prisoner, make sure he's fit to stand trial if it comes to that." Hardison's voice came back thick with suspicion. "You got 5 minutes, Solomon. Not 1 second more." Solomon stepped closer to the bars and spoke in a voice so low it barely qualified as sound. "I can't stop them. Harry's got the whole town worked up into a lynch mob. They're coming for you probably within the hour." "I know," Watkins said quietly. Solomon's hands fumbled with the canvas bag, pulling out bandages and a bottle of carbolic as if he were preparing to treat injuries. But hidden among the medical supplies, His fingers closed around something else. A slim surgical scalpel and a length of thin wire. He pressed them through the bars into Wagon's waiting hand. Wait until the crowd is at its loudest. Solomon whispered, his lips barely moving. They'll rush the jail all at once, and in that confusion, you might have a chance. The lock mechanism is old, but well maintained. If you can work the scalpel into the keyhole while using the wire to trip the tumblers, he trailed off, knowing the odds were slim, but better than nothing. Why do you help me? Juan asked, genuinely curious. I am not your people. Your brother is your blood. Solomon's face twisted with something that might have been pain or shame, or both mixed together. Because Godfrey stopped being my brother. The day he decided that power and land mattered more than human lives. Because I took an oath to do no harm, and watching an innocent man hang for crimes he didn't commit would violate that oath more thoroughly than anything else I could imagine. He paused, then added, and because I've been collecting evidence against my brother for months now, sending copies of documents and witness statements to a territorial marshal I trust. Someone needs to survive long enough to make sure that evidence sees the light of day. Juan closed his hand around the scalpel and wire, hiding them in his palm. Thank you, he said simply. Solomon nodded. On once gathered his supplies back into the bag and called out to Hardison. He's fit enough, Sheriff. No signs of injury or disease. He walked away without looking back, and Wakan was alone again in the dark cell with small, fragile tools and a slim chance that might be enough if luck decided to favor him for once. Outside, the crowd grew louder, their voices rising in a chant that Wakan could not quite make out, but whose meaning was clear enough. They were working themselves up to violence, stoking their courage with whiskey and Pike's smooth words. Wakan sat on the cot and worked the scalpel into the keyhole of his cell door, his fingers moving with the careful precision of a man who understood that his life depended on getting this right. The lock mechanism was complex, full of small pins and tumblers that needed to be manipulated in exactly the right sequence. He worked slowly, feeling for the resistance points, using the wire to probe and lift. The sound of breaking glass made him pause. Through the high window, he heard shouting, heard the crowd surge forward with a roar like an angry beast. Rocks smashed through windows, shattering them inward. Men were yelling for justice, for vengeance, for blood. Wakan returned to his work, his hands steady, even as his heart pounded faster. One tumbler lifted, then another. The mechanism was beginning to yield slowly, reluctantly, but yielding nonetheless. The front door of the jail crashed open, and Hardison's voice rose in half-hearted protest. Now you folks, just hold on a minute. This ain't the way to do things. We got laws and procedures. To hell with your laws, someone shouted back. That savage killed innocent people. He needs to hang, and he needs to hang now. Boots pounded on the floor, getting closer. Wakan worked faster, sweat running down his face despite the cool night air. The third tumbler lifted with a soft click that sounded as loud as a gunshot in his ears. One more, just one more. The cell door rattled as someone grabbed the bars from outside. Hard Harry's scarred face appeared in the dim light from the front room, his grin wide and mean. Well now, he drawled. Looks like your time's run out, savage. Hope you made your peace with whatever gods your people pray to. He fumbled with a key ring, searching for the right one to open the cell door. Behind him, the narrow hallway was packed with men holding torches and rope, their faces twisted with righteous fury. Wakan gave the wire one final desperate twist. The fourth tumbler lifted with a click, and the lock mechanism released. The cell door was still held shut by Harry's grip on the bars, but it was no longer locked. When Harry found the key and turned it in the lock, expecting resistance, the sudden lack of it threw him off balance. Walken exploded into motion, slamming his shoulder into the door with all his strength. The iron bars hit Harry square in the face, and the foreman went down with a strangled cry, blood pouring from his shattered nose. Walken burst out of the cell into the packed hallway. Fists and elbows flew. Someone grabbed his arm and he twisted free, driving his elbow back into soft flesh. A deputy fired his pistol, but the bullet went wild in the confusion, smashing into the stone wall and sending chips flying. The crowd was packed too tight, unable to bring their weapons to bear without hitting each other. Wakan fought his way toward the back of the jail where he remembered seeing a rear door during his brief glimpse of the building. Men grabbed at him, and he threw them off with desperate strength. Someone hit him from behind, a blow that sent stars exploding across his vision. But he kept moving, kept fighting. He reached the back door and slammed into it with his shoulder. The wood splintered but held. He hit it again, and this time it flew open, depositing him into the dark alley behind the jail. Solomon was there holding the reins of 2 horses and breathing hard. "Go," he gasped. "They'll be right behind you." Juan grabbed the reins and swung up into the saddle, his battered body screaming protest. "Come with me," he said. Solomon shook his head. "I have to stay. Someone needs to keep working against Godfrey from inside. But you need to save Valeria and the boy. Pike's men are going after them next." "Where?" Wakan demanded. "The old Hricks placed north edge of town," Solomon said quickly. "I told them to hide there. It's abandoned, but it has 4 walls and a roof." "Go now," before the back door crashed open again, and men poured out into the alley, their shouts echoing off the walls. Solomon slapped the horse's rump hard, and the animal bolted forward into the darkness. Walkan bent low over its neck, urging it faster, while bullets winded past his head like angry insects. He rode through the dark streets of Copper Creek, taking corners at reckless speed, trusting the horse to find its footing. Behind him, the sounds of pursuit grew louder. Men mounting horses, shouting directions to each other, organizing a hunt. The Hendricks place stood at the northern edge of town, a sagging 2-story structure with boarded windows and a porch that had partially collapsed under years of neglect. Wakan dismounted while his horse was still moving and ran to the front door, which hung half open on broken hinges. "Valeria!" he called out, keeping his voice low but urgent. "It's Wakan. We have to leave now." Movement in the darkness, and then Valeria appeared at the top of a rickety staircase, Roland in her arms, and Esther moving slowly behind her. "They're coming, aren't they?" she asked, her voice remarkably calm. "Yes," Wakan said. "Pike's men know where you are. We have maybe minutes, not hours." They came down the stairs quickly, Valeria moving with the sure-footed grace of someone who had learned not to waste time on fear. Outside, the sound of hooves was getting closer, coming from multiple directions. "There are too many to fight," Wakan said, thinking quickly. "And they know this town better than we do. We need to go somewhere. They won't expect somewhere we can make a stand or hide until we can get help." "Where?" Valeria asked. Wakan thought of the ledger, thought of the water rights, and the illegal schemes Pike had been running. "The old Pike Ranch," he said. "The one Godfrey abandoned when he built his new spread. Solomon mentioned it once. Said Godfrey uses it to store supplies for his operations that aren't quite legal. If we can get there, we might find evidence that backs up what's in the ledger. And it's the last place they'll think to look for us." It was a desperate plan full of risks and unknowns, but desperation was all they had left. They rode north through the darkness, 4 people on 3 horses moving as quickly as they dared across unfamiliar terrain. Behind them, the lights of Copper Creek faded into the distance, and the sounds of pursuit scattered as Pike's men searched in multiple directions. The old Pike Ranch sat in a shallow valley, 5 miles north of town, accessible only by a narrow trail that wound through broken country full of ravines and loose rock. By the time they reached it, false dawn was beginning to lighten the eastern sky, painting the clouds in shades of gray and pale pink. The ranch buildings were in worse shape than Wakan had hoped. The main house had partially burned at some point, leaving only the stone foundation and a few charred timbers reaching toward the sky like blackened fingers. But there was a barn that still stood mostly intact, and beyond it, half hidden by a stand of cottonwoods, was a low structure built into the hillside. "That's a root cellar or storage bunker," Valeria said, studying it. "My father had one like it back in Kansas, built into the earth to stay cool in summer and warm in winter." They approached cautiously, but the place seemed genuinely abandoned. The bunker's heavy wooden door hung open on iron hinges, revealing a dark interior that smelled of damp earth and old hay. Wakan struck a match and held it up, revealing a space about 20 ft long and 10 ft wide with timber supports holding up the earth and ceiling and crates stacked along the walls. He moved deeper inside, checking for animals or recent signs of human presence, and his match illuminated something that made his breath catch. The crates were stamped with government markings, rifles, ammunition, and supplies that should have been delivered to army posts or territorial offices, but had somehow ended up here instead. "This is what Pike has been doing," Valeria said, moving to stand beside him. Her face was grim in the flickering light. "Stealing government shipments, selling them for profit, and using the money to buy more land and power. The ledger mentioned military contracts that disappeared, but I didn't understand what it meant until now." "It means we have him," Wakan said quietly. "This evidence combined with the ledger is enough to bring federal marshals and possibly even army investigators. Pike can bribe local sheriffs, but he can't bribe everyone. But first, we have to survive long enough to get the word out," Esther said from the doorway, her voice weak but steady. "And they're going to come looking for us here eventually. We need a plan." Wakan looked around the bunker, his mind working through possibilities. The structure was solid, built into the hillside with earth packed thick around and above it. The door could be barricaded from inside, and the narrow entrance would force attackers to come at them one or two at a time, giving away their advantage of numbers. But there was also danger here. The timber supports that held up the ceiling were old and dry, and the earth packed around them was loose. A fire set at the wrong place could collapse the whole structure, burying them alive. It was a stronghold and a trap at the same time. "We make our stand here," he said. "Finally, we send Roland out on the fastest horse with a message to the territorial marshal, and we hold until help arrives or Pike gives up." "He won't give up," Valeria said quietly. "He can't afford to. Too much is at stake." "I know," Wakan said. He looked at her, and in the dim light, he could see the exhaustion written in every line of her body, could see the fear she was working so hard to hide. "But we have no other choice, and sometimes when you have no choice, you discover you're stronger than you knew." Valeria held his gaze for a long moment, then nodded. "All right," she said. "Then we fight." They spent the next hour preparing their defense, working with the desperate efficiency of people who knew their time was limited. Wakan and Delson, who had caught up with them during the night ride, reinforced the door with heavy timbers dragged from the ruined house. Yazi climbed to the top of the bunker's earthen roof and kept watch, his sharp eyes scanning the approaches for any sign of riders. Inside the bunker, Valeria organized their meager supplies, water, a little food, ammunition for the rifles they had taken from Pike's stolen crates. She made sure Roland understood the plan, explaining it in simple, clear terms that the boy could grasp. "You're going to ride to find help," she told him, crouching down so they were eye to eye. "You're going to take the fastest horse and ride hard for the territorial marshal's office in Silver Fork. It's 2 days' ride, maybe less, if you don't stop except to rest the horse. You're going to give him this letter." She pressed a folded paper into his hands, sealed with wax. "And you're going to tell him what happened? Can you do that?" Roland's face was pale but determined. "What if the bad men catch me?" he asked, his voice small. "They won't," Valeria said with a confidence she did not entirely feel. "Because you're smart and brave, and you're going to ride like the wind. And because Wakan is going to make sure they're too busy with us to chase after you." Roland looked at Wakan, who nodded, once his face serious. "You can do this," Wakan said. "I have seen your courage. You are stronger than you know." They sent him off just as the sun cleared the horizon, giving the boy a head start before Pike's men could organize a proper search. Valeria watched him ride away until he was just a speck against the golden morning light. And then she turned back to the bunker, with tears on her face that she wiped away with an angry gesture. "He'll make it," Wakan said quietly. "He has to," Valeria replied. "Because if he doesn't, none of this matters." Pike's men found them just after noon. Yazi spotted them first, a line of riders coming from the south, maybe 15 strong, with Hard Harry and Cutter in the lead. Cutter was Pike's other lieutenant, a man with mean eyes and a reputation for enjoying the violence of his work. They came on slowly, spreading out as they approached, surrounding the bunker in a loose half-circle that cut off most escape routes. Juan gathered everyone inside and barred the door, leaving just a narrow gap through which they could observe and fire if necessary. The riders stopped about 50 yards out, just beyond easy rifle range, and sat their horses while they studied the situation. Then Godfrey Pike himself rode forward, his black coat dusty from travel, but his bearing still confident and commanding. He stopped his horse and called out his voice, carrying easily across the open ground. "You in there, this doesn't have to end badly. Send out the ledger and the woman, and the rest of you can walk away. You have my word as a gentleman." Wakan almost laughed at the absurdity of that offer. Instead, he called back, "Your word means nothing. We know what you did. We have proof of your crimes. Federal marshals are already on their way." Pike's face darkened, but his voice remained calm. "Then you're fools. Those marshals won't arrive for days if they come at all. And I control this valley. I control the sheriff, the town council, the telegraph lines, everything. You have nowhere to go and no one to help you." "We have each other," Valeria shouted from beside Wakan. "And we have the truth. That's more than you'll ever have." For a moment, Pike sat motionless on his horse, and Walken could see him calculating odds and options. Then he turned to Cutter and said something too low to hear. Cutter grinned, showing crooked teeth, and gestured to several of his men. They dismounted and began gathering dry brush and wood from the surrounding area, piling it near the bunker's entrance. The meaning was clear. If they couldn't force their way in, they would smoke their quarry out or burn them alive. Wakan felt Valeria tense beside him. "We can't let them set that fire," she said urgently. "The smoke will kill us faster than the flames." "I know," Wakan said. He was already moving, pulling her toward the back of the bunker where the shadows were deepest. "There is another way. These old bunkers sometimes have escape tunnels dug during construction in case of cave-ins. Help me look." They searched frantically, hands moving over the earthen walls, looking for any sign of a hidden opening. Esther joined them, her broken arm making her clumsy, but her determination undemeaned. Delson kept watch at the door, while Yaji remained on the roof, occasionally firing shots to keep Pike's men honest and at a distance. Wakan's fingers found what he was looking for, a section of the wall where the earth was looser, less packed, and behind it the faint sound of hollow space. He grabbed a shovel from the pile of tools in the corner and began digging, tearing into the wall with desperate speed. Outside, Cutter's men had finished building their pile of kindling and were preparing to light it. Wakan could hear Pike giving orders, his voice calm and methodical, as if he were discussing nothing more important than the price of cattle. Wakan's shovel broke through into empty space, and cool air rushed out of the opening he had created. He widened the hole quickly, revealing a narrow tunnel barely wide enough for a person to crawl through, sloping downward into darkness. "Go," he told Valeria. "Take your mother and follow the tunnel. It should come out somewhere downslope, probably in the trees." Valeria stared at him, understanding flooding her face. "You're not coming," she said. It was not a question. "Someone has to stay and hold them here long enough for you to get clear." Wakan said, "Delsin, Yazi, and I will keep them busy. When you hear the shooting start, you run. Don't stop. Don't look back. Just run." "I won't leave you," Valeria said, her voice fierce. "Not after everything." "You have to," Wakan interrupted gently. "For Roland, for your mother, for all the people Pike has hurt and will hurt if he's not stopped. You have to survive to tell this story." Valeria's eyes filled with tears, but she did not argue further. Instead, she reached out and gripped his hand hard enough to hurt her fingers, intertwining with his. "Don't you dare die," she said. "Don't you dare. Because when this is over, we have things to talk about. Important things." Wakan felt something shift in his chest, something warm and painful and achingly precious. "I will do my best," he said quietly. "Now go." She went, helping Esther into the tunnel first, then crawling in after her, her torn dress disappearing into the darkness. Wakan covered the entrance as best he could with loose earth and crates, making it look like nothing had been disturbed. Outside, flames crackled as Cutter's men lit their kindling. Smoke began to seep through cracks around the door, thin at first, but growing thicker. Wakan moved to join Delsin and Yazi at the door, checking his rifle and the spare ammunition he had taken from the stolen crates. "They are lighting the fire," Delsin observed calmly. "We will die from smoke before the flames reach us." "Then we give them something else to think about," Wakan said. He took a deep breath, offered a silent prayer to his ancestors, and kicked the door open. The 3 Lakota warriors burst out of the bunker in a rush, firing as they came. Pike's men caught by surprise, while they tended the growing fire scattered in confusion. Wakan shot the nearest man, saw him fall, then rolled behind a water trough that provided scant cover. Yazi went left, his bow singing, while Delsin went right with his rifle. The fight that followed was chaos, smoke and noise, and the acrid smell of gunpowder hanging thick in the air. Wakan lost track of time, measuring it only in shots fired and targets dropped. He felt a bullet graze his left arm, felt the hot sting of it. But he kept moving, kept firing, kept drawing attention away from the tunnel where Valeria and Esther were hopefully making their escape. Then everything changed. A man Wakan had not seen before stepped out from behind Pike's horse. He was young, maybe 25, with the look of a deputy or lawman, clean-shaven, wearing a vest with a badge pinned to it, holding a rifle with the easy confidence of someone who knew how to use it. "Hold your fire," the man shouted, his voice carrying with unexpected authority. "I'm Deputy Hayes, Territorial Marshal's office. Everyone, lower your weapons now." The shooting stopped as if someone had thrown a switch. Pike's men looked at each other in confusion, unsure whether to obey or ignore the order. Pike himself sat frozen on his horse, his face a mask of shock that was rapidly transforming into fury. Hayes walked forward into the no-man's land between the two sides, his badge glinting in the afternoon sun. "Mr. Pike," he said, his voice formal and hard, "you and your men are under arrest for murder, theft of government property, and conspiracy to defraud the United States government. Territorial Marshal Garrett received information about your activities several weeks ago and sent me to investigate. I've been watching this ranch for 3 days, documenting everything, and I now have all the evidence I need." Pike's face went purple with rage. "You have no authority here, boy. This is my land, my territory." "Not anymore," Hayes said calmly. He gestured and more men stepped out of the trees, 6 of them all carrying rifles, all wearing badges. "Federal jurisdiction trumps local corruption. Mr. Pike, you're done." For a moment that hung suspended like a drop of water about to fall, Pike sat rigid in his saddle, his hand moving toward the rifle on his saddle holster. Wakan saw it happening and shouted a warning, but Pike was already moving, pulling the rifle free and swinging it toward Hayes. Wakan fired. His bullet took Pike in the shoulder, spinning him sideways. Hayes fired a split second later, his shot more carefully aimed, taking Pike in the chest. Godfrey Pike fell from his horse and lay still in the dust, his blood soaking into the earth he had killed so many to possess. The fight went out of Pike's men like air from a punctured bladder. They dropped their weapons and raised their hands, their faces showing relief that it was finally over. Cutter tried to run, making it maybe 10 yards, before one of Hayes's men brought him down with a shot to the leg. Juan lowered his rifle, his hands shaking with exhaustion and the aftermath of adrenaline. He became aware of pain in his arm where the bullet had grazed him, aware of bruises and cuts he had not noticed during the fight. Yaji and Delson moved to stand beside him, their faces grim but triumphant. Hayes walked over to Wakan, studying him with sharp, intelligent eyes. "You're Wakan," he said. It was not a question. "Dr. Solomon Pike wrote about you in his reports, said you were the one who saved the Roman family and gathered the evidence against Godfrey." "Solomon sent you?" Wakan asked, surprised. Hayes nodded. "He's been my informant for months, sending letters and documents through channels his brother didn't control. When he wrote that things were coming to a head, that Godfrey had committed murder and was trying to cover it up by blaming the Lakota marshal. Garrett sent me here fast as I could ride. I got to Copper Creek last night just after you broke out of jail, and I've been tracking you since." He paused, then added quietly, "I'm sorry I couldn't reveal myself sooner. I needed to catch Godfrey in the act with witnesses and evidence that couldn't be disputed." "Where is Solomon now?" Wakan asked. Hayes's face darkened. "In custody, I'm afraid. When his brother realized he'd been betrayed, he tried to kill him. Solomon's alive, but he's hurt. The town doctor is tending to him at the clinic." Wakan felt something cold settle in his stomach. Before he could ask more questions, a shout came from the trees. Valeria emerged from the undergrowth supporting Esther. Both of them covered in dirt, but alive and unharmed. When she saw Wakan standing there bleeding but alive, her face crumpled, and she ran to him, throwing her arms around him with enough force to make him stagger. "You're alive," she said into his chest, her voice muffled and choked with tears. "I heard the shooting and I thought, I am alive," Wakan said softly, wrapping his arms around her despite the pain it caused. "We all are. It is over." She pulled back just far enough to look up at him, and in her eyes he saw something that made his heart skip and race. "When this is done," she said fiercely, "when all the official business is finished and we're finally safe, you and I are going to have a very long conversation about what happens next. Do you understand?" Wakan understood. He understood perfectly. "Yes," he said simply. "I understand." Deputy Hayes cleared his throat diplomatically. "I hate to interrupt," he said, "but we need to get statements from all of you, and we need to secure this evidence before anything else happens. If you'll come with me back to Copper Creek, we can start sorting this out." They rode back to town in a strange procession. Federal deputies, captured criminals, and the survivors of Pike's ambitions all mixed together. By the time they reached Copper Creek, word had spread, and half the town had turned out to see Godfrey Pike's body draped over his horse and his men in chains. Sheriff Hardison, seeing which way the wind was blowing, tried to disappear into the crowd. Hayes's men arrested him before he made it 2 blocks. The next few days were a blur of official proceedings. Marshal Garrett arrived from the territorial capital, a hard-faced man in his 50s, who looked like he had seen everything twice and been unimpressed both times. He took statements from everyone involved, examined the ledger and the stolen government supplies, and interviewed witnesses from town, who were suddenly very willing to talk about Pike's crimes now that the man was dead and could not retaliate. Solomon Pike recovered from his injuries, a severe beating that had broken 2 ribs and given him a concussion, but nothing that would not heal with time. When he was well enough to walk, he came to the clinic where Valeria had set up her practice in the building he had left to her in his will. The will itself had been something of a surprise. Solomon had updated it weeks before the final confrontation, leaving the clinic his house and a small amount of money to Valeria, with the stipulation that she render care without prejudice to settler or Lakota alike. He had also included a signed recommendation, now backed by Marshal Garrett's official stamp, for continued medical support to the Lakota bands in exchange for peaceful passage and mutual aid during harsh winters. "You knew," Valeria said when Solomon explained. "You knew what your brother was going to do, and you planned for it." Solomon's battered face managed a weak smile. "I knew Godfrey would never stop, never change. I knew eventually it would come to violence, and I wanted to make sure that if I didn't survive, something good might still come from all this tragedy." He looked at Wakan, who stood by the window watching the street. "You saved my life when you shot Godfrey. He was going to kill me that night in town. I owe you a debt I can never repay." "You owe me nothing," Wakan said quietly. "You have already paid more than anyone should have to pay to do what is right." Solomon left Copper Creek a week later, heading back east to stay with family and recover fully from his injuries. Before he left, he shook Wakan's hand and told Valeria, "Take care of this one. Men like him are rarer than gold and twice as valuable." The legal proceedings took months to fully resolve. Pike's estate was seized by the territorial government and auctioned off to pay restitution to his victims. The stolen government supplies were returned to their rightful owners. Sheriff Hardison was tried and convicted of corruption and accessory to murder, spending the rest of his life in a territorial prison. And slowly, carefully, Copper Creek began to heal. The Massacre Hill, where Victor and Roman had been buried, became a place of quiet remembrance. Grass grew back over the scarred earth, and wildflowers bloomed in the spring, purple lupine and yellow prairie roses that swayed in the wind. Simple wooden crosses and stone cairns marked the graves of the dead, both those killed by Pike's men and several of Pike's own men who had fallen in the final battle. It was to this place that Valeria rode one morning in early spring, 8 months after the events that had brought her to Copper Creek. Wakan rode with her and Roland and Esther, whose arm had healed enough that she could ride without assistance. Yazy and Delson accompanied them along with several Lakota elders from Wakan's band who had come to witness and bless what was about to happen. They gathered at the top of the hill where the wind blew clean and strong, carrying the smell of new grass and distant rain. Snorts. Valeria wore a simple dress of blue cotton, her hair braided with strips of leather and small white beads that caught the morning sun. Juan wore traditional clothes, buckskin leggings, and a shirt decorated with porcupine quills, his long hair loose and flowing. One of the elders, a woman named Mia, who had known Wakan since he was born, spoke in Lakota, her voice carrying the weight of tradition and blessing. She talked about the joining of two peoples, about the strength that came from unity instead of division, about the importance of remembering the dead while living fully for the sake of those still breathing. When she finished, she tied a strip of soft deerskin around Wakan and Valeria's joined hands, binding them together in the traditional way. Then a settler minister brought from town at Valeria's request spoke words from his own tradition about love and commitment and building a future together. Roland stood beside them holding a bundle of dried sage that he would burn later as an offering to the spirits and the dead. Esther watched with tears on her face, but they were tears of joy mixed with grief, happy that her daughter had found someone worthy of her strength and courage, sad that Victor and Roman could not be there to see it. When it was done, when all the words had been spoken and the blessings given, Walken and Valeria stood together at the edge of the hill and looked out over the land that stretched away in all directions. The prairie was turning green with spring, and in the distance they could see Copper Creek winding through the cottonwoods like a silver thread. "What do we do now?" Valeria asked quietly. Juan considered the question. "We live," he said finally. "We take care of the sick and injured. We teach Roland to be strong and kind. We build something that will last, something your father and grandfather would be proud of. We keep this land between our people shared and protected." "That sounds like a good plan," Valeria said. She leaned against him, and he wrapped his arm around her shoulders, holding her close. A freight wagon rattled along the road below, heading toward Copper Creek with supplies and mail from the outside world. Wakan automatically shifted his position, placing himself between the wagon and his new family, Valeria, Roland, Esther, and even Yazi and Delson, who had become as close as brothers through shared danger. Valeria noticed the protective gesture and smiled, laying her hand on his chest where she could feel his heartbeat steady and strong. "We keep this place between us," she said, repeating the words that had become their promise and their purpose. "Together, together." Juan agreed. They stood there as the sun climbed higher, warming the earth that held both their dead and their hopes for the future. The wind carried the scent of sage and wildflowers, and somewhere in the distance, an eagle called its cries sharp and clear and full of fierce joy. Below them, Roland placed stones carefully on the graves of his father and great-grandfather, and then stood back with his hand in Esther's. They were all here, the living and the dead, the Lakota and the settlers, the past and the future, woven together by blood spilled and justice fought for and love earned in the hardest ways possible. The future would not be easy. Seasons would turn, bringing drought and plenty cold and warmth. Treaties would be tested and sometimes broken. Old prejudices would not die quickly or without resistance. There would be more struggles ahead, more pain, more loss. But they would face it together. This unlikely family bound not by blood, but by choice and sacrifice, and the absolute determination to build something better than what had come before. Wakan had gone out hunting for meat on a summer morning that seemed like it belonged to another lifetime. Instead, he had found a family in the middle of a massacre, found a purpose larger than survival, and found a love he had never expected to deserve or receive. It was more than any hunt could ever bring. It was everything that mattered. They turned together and walked down the hill toward their horses, toward Copper Creek, toward the life they would build together, one day at a time. The prairie stretched out around them, harsh and beautiful and full of possibility. And as they rode away from the Massacre Hill for the last time, the sun broke through the clouds and painted the whole world gold. Even before they touched the latch, a thin breath of cool air slipped through a nail hole in the plank. The telltale draft of an old vent pipe buried in the berm,